months. Rajan Mathews, the Director General of COAI, joins in. Mr. Mathew, your key takeaways from what the Telecom Secretary had to tell us?
So very many positive elements in the NIA announcement by the Honorable Secretary. So clearly, quantum of spectrum is definitely a positive in terms of being able to set the SUC at a flat rate of 3% for this incremental spectrum. That's clearly a win in terms of the rollout obligations not being that onerous but being covered by existing bands. That's very positive. The fact that the funding mechanism is tied to the variable rate, hopefully that will change over the term of the installment payments. So lots of very good positive. The 30-day allotment component, that commitment, very positive. The fact of contiguous spectrum, very positive. So lots of very good things in the NIA that has been announced. Obviously, the critical issue is going to be one of uptake. What is the industry's appetite? Clearly, 1800 is going to be one of the key areas of interest. 700, as we've been saying, maybe some very limited uptake and interest, some interest in 2100, 2300, 25 and 700 tend to be the question marks in terms of spectrum.
Okay, so you've laid out the positives. We'll come back to you and to tell you, for you to tell us if there have been any negatives. But let me invite the other guest, Sanjay Kapoor, the former CEO of Bharti, Airtel of India and South Asia, and he's with us. Mr. Kapoor, good evening, and thanks so much for joining in. Tell us the key positives in the NIA this time around, as well as the negatives.
Well, I think I tend to agree with my friend Rajan that, a lot of spectrum being put on the table simultaneously actually takes away any artificial scarcity that gets created. And therefore, the real price really comes to be bid by everybody. I think that's very positive. All other points that Rajan has already covered, I don't want to repeat, but I think they are all positive. My big worry would be that after operators have spent a lot of money on spectrum in the last round, and there's refarming of spectrum that is happening as you and I talk to each other of the existing spectrum that got renewed. If that is true, then a lot of monies have to be committed to the use of existing spectrum and the last bid spectrum, which is still not seen by us. And therefore, if that has to be done, then lots of monies have to be committed to that. Given that, does the industry now have an appetite to amass more spectrum and then back it with more investments to deploy it? Because we also have to keep in mind that fiber backhaul is going to be a quintessential part of India's data story. And that's an investment that really has not happened in India as yet. And I hope over the next few years that happens to make our entire backbone very robust for a great data consumer experience to follow. So I think given the scenario, I think the spectrum will be picked very cautiously by operators. I tend to agree that a little bit of 1800 to make sure that it's deployed rightly behind LTE, and also some bands of 700 where 700 in some circle is very close to the price of 900. I think they should get picked. But will it be a big bounty for the government where people will really go crazy bidding? I don't see that happening given the commitments that operators have in hand today. Therefore, I think the response should be a little muted. It should not be an outrageous response like the one that we have seen in the past, because there was an artificial scarcity of spectrum. Overall, it seems positive. I think government is thinking in the right direction on every bit of their NIA.
Okay, so spectrum to be picked up cautiously. The response is not going to be as outrageous as we've seen in the past years. Stay on, gentlemen. We're also joined by Nitin Soni, the Director of Asia Pacific Corporate Ratings at Fitch, and he's with us now. Nitin, good evening. Most of our experts, the experts have highlighted a couple of positives. The biggest one being the quantity of spectrum which will be auctioned, which could result in rational bidding and cautious pickup demand by the operators. Your initial reading, and would it in any way change the credit profile of the operators that you track?
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. So We believe that, most of the telcos already have a stretched balance sheet, except maybe, the market leader, Bharti, Airtel, where leverage number is about 2.5 times. There will be limited participation in the upcoming auction. We believe most telcos have sufficient spectrum assets. They may try to fill up the gaps for 1800 or 2300 megahertz where they do not own the spectrum to launch 4G services. But we believe that there will be limited appetite for 700 megahertz spectrum, given the efficiency gains from deploying 4G services on 700 will be insufficient to offset the relatively high price, the reserve price, which was announced earlier by the TRAI, which was, if I remember correctly, was about 115 billion INR for a block of 700 megahertz spectrum.
Okay. Stay on, Nitin. Rajan, let me come back to you. Could you just once again reconfirm what the total amount of spectrum auctioned will be? He gave us a figure of 2354.5 megahertz. Will the 234 megahertz of harmonized spectrum be over and above it? Or did the figure of 2,354 include the harmonized spectrum bit as well from 1800 and 800?
The 2034, I believe, included it because I believe that the harmonization, the 1800, which was freed up as a result of the harmonization, was included in that. But again, we'll have to wait to see the details once the NIA document is available to us.
Okay, so it's more likely that the total amount of 2354.5 includes the harmonized bit. Mr. Mathews, a lot of our experts have, echoed what you've said, that participation could be a bit cautious. The response could be a bit muted compared to what we've seen in the past years. What's your sense of how much the government can rake in from this auction? Because they are putting more than 5.5 lakh crore worth of spectrum up for auctions and sale. If you had to give us a guess.
I think if I had to do that, I wouldn't be in this line of business. I'd probably be looking at some other line of business, prognosticating on what those outcomes are. But I think, both Sanjay and others have reiterated what it would be. If you do the math, if you look at 1800, it looks like most of the contiguous spectrum in 1800 would probably be taken up by various operators because, again, it's very conducive. There's a lot of ecosystem building up. The handset economy and the ecology is already there as opposed to some of the other bands. So I think it's a fair understanding that would probably be picked up based on the reserve prices that are there. Again, limited amount of 2300. So again, we'll have to wait to see the quantum of spectrum in those. So it's a bit risky to begin to prognosticate as to the outer amount. But certainly the headline numbers that the government was looking at in terms of 60,000 crore rupees appears to be a bit of a stretch.
Okay. Mr. Kapoor, would you like to hazard a guess of how much the government could possibly rake in given the stretched balance sheet as well as the requirement of the telecom operators?
Crystal ball gazing at this stage is being foolhardy. I wouldn't do that. But I can make a very wild guesstimate to say that I think this time round, the money that the government will be able to amass will be significantly short of what their aspiration is. Because given the balance sheets of all operators and given the pending commitments that they have to still roll out the 3G and 4G services, and like I said, a fiber backhaul is going to stretch them even more than what is there today, unless and until this country begins to see a significant improvement on price extraction from the consumers. If that happens, then the viability of operators goes up, which should happen according to me. Good quality data services are not going to happen at the current pricing. It's going to be very tough. But while I say that, you also have a big scare about a new operator coming into the market who is going to be hopefully very competitive and is going to run for money to everybody. So I think given those circumstances, operators' ability to raise prices at this stage is really a constraint. And if that is a constraint and all the other obligations are still pending of rolling out 4G and 3G, I think the response will be rather muted and the government's going to fall of its aspirations significantly.
Okay, so that's an important takeaway. The government will amass significantly lower than expected revenues in this auction. So, Mr. Kapoor, do you believe there is a possibility that the unauctioned spectrum will be put up for auctions at a lower price later on in the financial year? Because we've seen this in the past. I think in 2012 or 13, I could be wrong about the years, but in the past, when the spectrum was not taken up in the auctions, it was not bid for. The government, later on in the year, cut the prices by what, 35, 50, even going up to 50%, and then auctioned it later. Do you think there is a possibility of a second auction by the end of FY17?
Well, auction is going to be a continuous process. And
no, but with significantly lower pricing.
Yeah, I'm coming to that. And the fact that this industry is spectrum hungry is not going to go away. Even if the top 2 or 3 operators had 100 megs of spectrum eventually, they're going to still fall short of what the consumer can consume on data, right? So that sort of a demand sits, which is an embedded demand that sits in the marketplace, and especially in Indian marketplace. Given that, I'm a believer of the law of diminishing returns. With every additional quantity of spectrum consumed, the need to buy more spectrum at the same price is going to go down. Therefore, it is a very obvious structure that the reserve price should come down. I've also always advocated that I think given the true picture in the market, there is need to bring down the reserve prices anyway. I know it's a very tough job for the policymakers because of the scams that have happened, and there's a lot of turmoil around that. They can't do it. But I think somehow we got to break that logjam and actually come down on the reserve price, because the actual price of the spectrum will get determined by the utility of that spectrum. And that the marginal utility will apply somewhere. It can't happen that the nth unit of spectrum is also going to be desirable at the same price that I bought the first unit. So that doesn't work in economics. I hope that that sustains over here, and eventually the reserve price comes down, because the real price of the spectrum will get governed by more participation. If you have a very high reserve price, then some guys are weeded out day one. Let's not weed them out. Let them all participate, and let the market discover the right price going forward.
Okay, the point that all our experts are making is about the stretched balance sheet of the telecom operators, and that is going to constrain them. Just to give you a reference, Idea's net debt to EBITDA stands at 3.06 as per the numbers which have just been announced 30 minutes ago. Their net debt stands at 37,657 crore. For Bharti, the net debt is close to 83,500 crore rupees. So that's the debt that we're going to be talking about, and they've been making the point that it's not just the amount that you spend on acquiring the spectrum. You also need to make a lot of investments after you acquire the spectrum, and capex for all these companies has been running pretty high for the last few years. On that note, gentlemen, we'll thank you for joining us on CNBC TV 18 and throwing perspective on this issue. So there we have it. The government has sent out the notice inviting applications, pretty much the official kickoff for the auctions, which will be held on the 29th of September. The key takeaways are: the big positive is the increased quantity of supply, which will be up for auction, and that perhaps will limit, and that perhaps will result in the telecom operators bidding cautiously. 1800 megahertz of spectrum is likely to be lapped up, especially the contiguous spectrum, perhaps 2100 megahertz to fill in the 3G gaps. But on the others, there are still question marks. So the offtake could be lower. And, one of our experts also believe that the government could amass lower revenues from this auction than what, we had, perhaps what they had, expected. So let's see how that goes. But on the whole, the increased quantity of spectrum, which is up for auctions, is a big positive for telecom operators. With that, we'll slip into a very short break. We'll come back with more on the markets.